Okay, folks. My phone says it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started so we keep things on time today. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. In a minute, we're going to introduce our panelists. I just want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about in here today. Back in 2002, when I started looking into this subject, Bruce Schneier wrote one of his inevitable little exposés on outsourcing security functions. And he made the observation that the benefits are very attractive and the risks are very considerable. And 13 years later, I don't think anything's changed. So we're going to kind of talk about that on our panel today and do that. We're going to look at, what we get out of it, some of the benefits that are talked about in the trade papers are reduced costs, better technology or expertise than we can hire. For those that heard Helen talk this morning about talent, maybe outsourcing is a way to pull in some talent. Also support if you have a 24-hour operation but you don't want to staff for it. So there are some definite benefits. Of course, the downsides, information leakage, loss of control, and in a lot of cases, a loss of flexibility. So there are definitely ups and downs with this. Some of the things that, and for heaven's sakes, visit our vendors who are here and supporting our conference. Several of them are managed service providers in different ways, and they certainly have solutions to offer us. Network monitoring, scanning, host security, antivirus management. There's any number of vendors that will help us with those things. So I also want this to be, and the panel wants this to be, a participatory thing. So as questions arise, please raise your hand. We'll get to you as quickly as we can. We'll have the panelists answer questions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. Jeff, do you want to start?
Jeffrey Sweet. I manage the cybersecurity testing and assessments team at AEP. And actually, I came from a contracting background, so I was one of the outsourced people, so that's where I come from. I'm also responsible for third-party risk governance, so I understand the risk third parties give to you.
Sasan Attari. I'm on the information security team at DSW. We don't currently have any outside sourced security services, but we have in very recent past actively looked through a nice plethora of them. So we'll have hopefully some conversation about that.
Carla Donev, Director of IT Risk Management for Cardinal Health. I actually just transitioned from IT security, where we do have some outsourced functions that we can bring some experience to. So we don't outsource risk management at this point in time. So, but, there's a lot of good topics, a lot of great folks here, and I think we'll have a great discussion today.
Greg Franz, I lead the attack and penetration team at Nationwide. And we have a hybrid model at Nationwide where we're using outsourcing in both areas of contract management as well as staff augmentation.
Go ahead.
Little Holmes, managed information security operations at Scotts Miracle-Gro. We have a kind of a hybrid. We have things we outsource, some things on site too that we do.
So I'm Helen Patton, and I can't work a microphone. I'm a CISO at OSU, and for my OSU colleagues, you already have my security roadmap, so don't expect that you're going to get any strategy out of me in terms of what's insourced and outsourced, so if that's why you're here, you can head on out. We at OSU, I think one of the things we've got to work out pretty quickly here in this room is what do we mean by outsource, and if it means we're paying somebody else to do something, or it means there's a service of, say, a threat feed, or legal guidance, or investigations after an incident. I think there's a broad range of what we could be talking about in the outsourced world. At OSU, most of our day-to-day operations are in-house, but all the things I just talked about, we're certainly looking to outside groups to help us augment the skills that we already have.
Okay. So one of the things that kind of wasn't explicitly said, but is evident talking to folks, and I know from our prep work for this talk, that no one on the panel, and I suspect very few here, completely outsource their security operations. Is there anyone that does? I would have been very surprised to see your hand. So the first question for the panel I'm going to start with is we're working with hybrid models. So, for some of you, if you could comment on what you're doing and without giving away everything, and who, what kind of things you're using the outsourced providers for, and what you prefer to, if you're not considering things, what do you prefer to keep in-house? Greg?
So when I looked at outsourcing in this panel today, I really thought a lot about what our keynote opened up with yesterday. Bill talked about what is it that we're tasked with protecting. And when I look at outsourcing, that's a key question for me. What is it that I'm tasked with protecting? And then how can I set up my strategy that outlines that protection? And then once I look at that, where do I see outsourcing and where can my team inside be able to manage and deal with those tasks? That's really what's going to help us to work. And it's all about, for me, it's about setting that strategy down, understanding my impact to that, and then being able to look at, do I want that inside or outside from an outsourcing standpoint?
Anyone else? Somebody have a real-life example they're working with? Or?
So I think a lot of times for us, we look at 24-hour operations. We don't have the staffing for that. Also, expertise in-house. A lot of times pen testing or managed SIM solution, 24-hour incident response. You have to have somebody outside to help you if you don't have the staffing for it.
So apparently I lied earlier in my opening statement. We actually do some of the outsourcing that we've been talking about. So like pen testing, we do have an outside series of providers that help us with that. As far as strategy goes at DSW, what we have learned in our conversations is that there's some sort of an inverse timeline to learn when you bring somebody from the outside to do anything. On day one, you may know all there is to know about your day-to-day operations, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate for data flow, for where packets go and how they get there. Whereas the service provider you may be engaging with may know nothing about your internal operations, but they may know very much about what those packets ought to look like in a given set of environments, or what the outside world sees when those packets are flowing in a certain fashion. And that as time passes on, we as the hiring organization may learn more about what the dangers are, or what the appropriateness of those things that are flowing in and out of our infrastructure might look like. Whereas they, as the outside service provider helping us, begin to learn more about our internal operations. And so I would suggest that even if you did say we were going to outsource today, for a given capability, that over time you may want to rethink about that. There is a crossover point where they're starting to learn more about your business. That's great. But at the crossover point where they are learning less about your business and you're learning less about what the issues are and how to handle those, there may be a time to rethink the engagement.
One thing, when you do start outsourcing, especially the human aspect of it, the human resources, you also have to look at that cost, because eventually the cost of keeping contract staff or staff aug can become more than what it would be to have a full-time employee on your staff. So you really have to evaluate that and look at that and make sure that you're not exceeding your true cost of outsourcing. So we did that at AEP. We looked at that cost and realized that we were paying more for the contractors because of the term of the contract, the length of time we were keeping the staff augs on. We realized it was actually more beneficial to bring them on as full-time employees.
Question?
I guess I had a question. I think to touch on your point is at what point does it become more expensive, I'll say, to outsource a function? Because I've seen that where you outsource a function, let's say app development, and you get stuck in one of two situations. One is, what does the contract say that this group is supposed to provide, and what's covered in it, and you end up in this, I won't say litigation, but you have both attorneys on both sides trying to figure out, is it a service we pay for, or is it a service that is supposed to be providing in the contract? your clients or customers because of outsourced function, and it's not being it's different than if I'm like sitting next to someone and going, we both work for the same company, we need to get this done, let's work together to get it done. Now I'm working with somebody externally, and that time to market. So how do you manage those two things, the contract aspect and then the interaction that you would have? That's different.
So the way I look at it is twofold. One, I mean, you gotta set your scope of what you want that work to be, and you gotta maintain that scope just like any other project. Make sure that you don't exceed your scope. The problem that I see with some outsourcing is that they tend to turn over fairly rapidly. Contract help tends to leave on a much more rapid basis than a full-time help. So are you spending more and more time bringing that person up to speed to be able to do that work that you need them to do than you're actually getting value out of them because they've turned over in 3, 6 months, a year down the road, however long your contract is. So you gotta weigh a lot of things out, and it's unique for each for each organization because it depends on how much your personnel costs are and what you're getting your contract person for. So you gotta kind of weigh a lot of different things out. But what we were seeing is that we had so much turnover, we spent more time training the people to do the job than we were getting value out of them, and it was costing us more in the long run than just having a full-time employee and then building that stability in the organization.
I think one thing that a lot of people don't look at is the quality you get too. When you look at cost, if you're outsourcing something to somebody who's outsourcing it again to somebody offshore, a lot of times the benefits you get, you're only getting a small percentage sometimes of return on your value. So when you go to the HR department, you're saying we're spending this much, but really if you look at what the actual benefits you're getting from those individuals, you're paying a lot more for the benefits. You're paying, for 75% of the work, you're paying 100% price. So a lot of people don't look at that.
The other thing a lot of people don't consider is when you do start outsourcing and you're going offshore, the cost of maintaining the security of the communications between that offshore provider. There's also export regulations that you have to consider, and whether or not they're even able to see the data that you're allowing them to have access to. If you're in a control system, a critical infrastructure business, or if you're in something that's highly cryptographic, there's a lot of export regulations around that may cost you money to maintain the licenses that you can have to be able to actually support that offshore engagement.
Okay, back to one other part of his question. Anybody want to address contractual considerations when you're signing a contract with a provider, things that you look for, or red flags? Or
So I've dealt with contracts where you had to, every line item, you had to specify what you wanted. The nice thing is the people that I did that contract with, they were very relational. So they were on board as a team member, and I've dealt with other people where you had a contract that was in stone, but they didn't want anything to do with you. It says 7 days in the contract. When I worked for the government, one of the contracts they had to replace a desktop on one of the people's desks, 7 days. So that person sat there for 7 days not doing anything because they didn't have spare desktops to repair that. So your contract is going to make your break it. If you're I've dealt with companies who are very relational. They never looked at the contract. They're like, "What do you want done? How can I help you?" Those are the people you want to find. Sometimes the bigger organizations you get lost, and they're more worried about the buck and the timeline. They don't have that relationship with the smaller companies. A lot of times they live and die off of their reputation.
I would have to agree with that relational aspect of it. That is important for me as well in two areas. One, from a staff augmentation, I'll look at bringing people in to do that staff augmentation, but I'll look at it from a project standpoint. What is my objective, to what Jeffrey said? How do I utilize that contract and that individual to get my objective done? And then is that a 6-month or is that a 1-year contract? Move that through. But relationship-wise, I heard a lot of these teams up here outsource their attack and pen team, which seems to be the one that I manage. I don't know that anybody on my team's here today, so I shouldn't probably talk about outsourcing too much from that standpoint. But we will look at outsourcing in that same area of what do I need somebody to do, and then how do I build off that relationship? Because that relationship to me is key, because that's where I'm going to get the value add. I know that they're in it for that value as well, and it ends up being a very good relationship.
If you're doing a staff org contract, my preference is to try and arrange it so it's fixed bid. So you're very clear on what the outcome of the staff org is, and you're looking to that completion of whatever that objective is, and then the risk is being assumed by the contract company in terms of how much resource needs to go into it. So it tends to keep them honest in terms of scoping it the right way. And really it allows you to set up much better agreements and expectations about what you expect out of the contract, right? So you need to think about that. I think the other thing, and I'm sure someone covered it in another topic, is the legal liability of the contractor, right? So you've really got to be clear right up front. If that pen test is going to knock over your network, that's probably not going to fly. So, what's in there from a liability perspective? If they're doing something and then you're hacked in that same area, are they on the hook? Are you on the hook? You've got to be really clear on that stuff up front. And I typically don't find my contract lawyers know the right questions to ask. So the other thing, you can outsource to other companies, people who will look at your contracts to make sure that you've got the right kind of language in the contract so that you're protected and that you're getting value out of the contract. And sometimes for big contracts, that's worth investing.
And that's the key thing too, is as you put your contracts together, especially if it's for a service or a long-term agreement, be very concise on what you're looking for and the types of protections you want in place. In our third-party risk governance program, we find that many organizations don't have good security practices. And that person, that representative that's coming into your organization, or that group of representatives that's coming into your organization, are going to perform the same security practices that their company performs, and not the ones that you perform. So you have to be very concise and make them aware of what your expectations are for the security of your information, the security of your organization, put them in writing, and then tell them that they have to hold to your standards and not their standards. It's unfortunately many times it's missed. They sign a contract, say I got a person for 6 months, and that's the extent of it. But they don't consider the security of the organization, the information that's within their organization, and where it goes when that person leaves, especially if they use their own assets, their own laptops, their cell phones, and stuff of that nature. They could be taking your data out. Devices might not be encrypted where you require your devices to be encrypted, and now they've lost your data.
Got a question over here?
We don't want to be a commodity, right? But a lot of times decision makers like commodities because they can do it apple to apple. Do you find more value in sitting down and actually doing an RFP and taking time to evaluate somebody, or do you want more of I need a shopping list and I want to see a set of services and kind of pick what would be a comparison?
So we actually went through the MSSP RFP about a year and a half ago, and it's really worthwhile to go down through our requirements and sit and talk with everyone and say, how do you meet these? And, as we went along, we actually modified our requirements, saying, oh, well, we can actually do that, we can do this. But the big concern there was the risk assessment of the vendors that we were looking at is, hey, we're sending all of our log data to them. We're basically sending them the keys to the kingdom. And we have to make sure that it's secure, that we're getting the right information back from them, and that it's actually executable, that there's actually an action we could take on it. And so it was a pretty detailed assessment that we did. And then from a contracting perspective, we went pretty detailed for the first time ever into the security requirements of what you do with our data and how you manage it and where it's allowed to go within the environment. Because what we're getting now is we're getting a lot of customer audits that are coming back to us as a company, and the customers are saying, hey, what are you doing with my data? Where are you sending my data? Who has access to it? And so that's where it's getting, from the contracting perspective, really important now, because we're having to go back to our outsourced and our third-party providers saying, so we need you to validate this customer's data now. And so it's becoming full circle and a bigger issue for us. And so we're taking a deeper dive at the looks of where are we sending data and what are we doing with it from an outsourced perspective.
And the amount of detail that you put into that's got to depend on the risk level as well. What's the sensitivity of the information that you're having them deal with, and where do you want that data to go? And you have to look at that and decide, what's my risk? If that data gets exposed to someone that shouldn't have it, what's the risk to my company? So you got to look at that as you go through your contract agreements. We have a standard contract agreement that we use, but we negotiate it with every vendor that we talk to. And there's some points that we take out because it doesn't apply. There's some points that we modify to some degree. You just have to look at the risk and decide what you want in there and how detailed, how tight that has to be.
At the risk of sounding redundant, when we look at security solutions, whether it's a product or a service, there's still a contract or still a partnership that you need to go through your due diligence with. So because that they are just because they're a security-oriented service or product, doesn't mean I'm going to allow them to use an old version of Java on my environment. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to go do my due diligence on risk, assessing risk of that partnership with them. So you still have to go through all of that. Just because they have security in their name or in their title doesn't mean that they get past any of your gating items, any of your gates that you've set up in any other process for your company.
And I have to say, don't assume that because they are a security company that they're doing the right thing for security. I've assessed a number of security organizations, companies that are providing you product, and they don't have good security practices within their own organization. So you've got to look at it.
So I think there's one thing that you said, a word that's worth exploring, and that's commodity, right? As a security professional, I want to say security is the last freaking thing I ever want to outsource, right? There's a part of me that wants to sort of hold it as like, yeah. But the fact is, a lot of what we do is technology services, and so it's a business decision. Is the value we're getting out of the role worth going down the path of outsourcing? The challenge is there's lots of shades of grey in the security discipline. And so I'm going to look for a managed service provider, if I'm looking for it, for all of you OSU people, hypothetically. I'm going to look for a service provider who can give me commodity, because if you can't give me commodity, you're not going to give me economies of scale that's worth my while talking to you, right? But I also need that relationship, because we're going to hit shades of grey that the lawyers didn't think about in their contract, and we're going to have a trust environment that we can work with one another on. And so that is the art of doing security over and above outsourcing things that people are really comfortable with, network support or email or, coding or whatever, right? Because we will end up at some point having a conversation about something went wrong that we didn't anticipate, and we're going to start pointing fingers at one another. Hopefully not, but probably, right? So.
Quick question. Quick question on cloud and cloud-based services. Are any of your organizations looking at it?
In terms of security or in terms of in general?
I think you can also outsource security with cloud security elements and things like that. So I guess both. So understanding, from a technology standpoint, are you outsourcing or putting data out into the cloud? And then how do you manage the security once it's out there in the cloud and doing that oversight or everybody?
So we have cloud. So everything is contractual. Everything, all your standards should be in there. Cloud compliance, if you're PCI, if you're SOX, all that data has to be protected the same way. So the agreements that we do basically mirror our requirements internally. Make sure that they are compliant. We look at their audits that they do on themselves. We look at how many times they do vulnerability scans. Are they patching? Is the data segmented within the cloud? Because just because you say cloud, it's everything can be tossed in together. You could be sitting in a shared folder next to somebody. You want different VMs on there. You want different storage areas. It's the same thing with the contractor. You want to make sure that they are liable for what you're liable. You want to make sure that they're following all your rules and it's in black and white, and they can't come back and say, well, we didn't know that. Like, you want to cover, like Helen said, everything that you can. There'll still be gray areas, but everything you can think of that you're required to comply with.
And you may think that you're contracting with a single cloud provider sometimes, but one may be providing the application and another one might be providing your data storage. So you got to make sure, you got to ask the right questions to make sure where that is going, and make sure, again, if you don't want your data to cross boundaries, you got to ask them, where's your data centers at? Where's our data going? Is it going across boundaries that we don't want it to go across? So you got to look at it in depth. Again, it's too many times I'm finding that It's not one provider. It's 2 or 3 providers that are giving you the total service that you're asking for. So you gotta make sure that whatever contract language you put in place also applies to those additional providers under the main provider.
And if you deal internationally, you have to include all the international requirements, like safe harbor and stuff like that, because you may have it there, but if you're outsourcing it, they're putting it in some other country, you need to make sure that they're compliant.
Okay, so one of the things we've talked about, we've been talking about subjects in general, and I'm just going to do a show of hands, and this does not necessarily mean the company you're currently working for, it could be past experience. How many have outsourced pen testing or vulnerability scanning? Yeah, most of the room. That's a skill set that is often needed. What about something like monitoring or ongoing monitoring services, such as an IDS, IPS, or firewall monitoring? A smaller number, but we have people with experience with that. Okay. For the panelists, I didn't see if any of you raised your hands or not. I was looking forward. Okay. Since you raised your hand, the question is, have there been any notable success or failures with outsourcing those types of services, particularly monitored services?
At a previous company, I did use. They're here. I used a company that was in the hall, and we had a very good success of them actually doing monitoring, discovering things about what was passing through our firewalls at the time. We had mostly U.S.-based geography. We had pretty much a uniform layout of firewall configuration that they were all doing monitoring for us. We had very good response times from them. I'll say in the steady state, we had very good response times from them. It was a good, long-lasting relationship, but I'll say that up front, to get that took a lot of pain and suffering. We did have, it is exactly what I think I said earlier, is that there was a learning period for them to figure out what was normal for us and what isn't abnormal for us, for our data sets, for our infrastructure, and what we might care about versus what they think we might care about. So there were influxes of huge amounts of alerts and then nothing, and then a huge amount of alerts and then nothing, and that was all due to the learning period. So I'll say that for us, we had in the steady state, I will say it was a successful relationship, but it took some time to get there. It was not an overnight thing that we can call out an ROI in less than 3 years. It was not that.
On the pen testing side, which was one of the specific areas, don't think that the best price is going to get you, the highest price is going to get you the best result, nor is the cheapest price going to be the best savings. I've run into situations where we've gone with a medium price and we've gotten good service. We've gone with a low price and gotten good service. We've gone with a high price and gotten bad service. So vet them out, especially if you have unique situations within your environment that you're wanting to test. Make sure you call those out. Make sure that you know exactly what you want done. Scope it out, and scope out specifically the deliverables you want, and make sure that they maintain that. I've actually had to call a pen test company back in, finish up some work, because they didn't do what they said. They produced the report and said, where is this? Well, we didn't do that. It was in the contract. We had to call them back. I called them back on their dime, by the way. So if they've got a contractual agreement, make sure that they fulfill that contract. Don't let them off. Because you spent good money to get what you are asking for. If you don't get it, call them back.
I think from our perspective, I mentioned we do have an MSSP, and it was great for us when we were starting that part of our security team a couple years ago, and it was a good way for us to kind of start learning about ourselves from a security perspective. And since then, it's been basically a resource reason why we've kept it. It's a skill set. They're just doing tier 1, tier 2, diving through logs, and it is much cheaper to give it to somebody else to do than to hire a team for us right now to do that. And so that our folks on the team then can focus more on the very critical areas, and they're actually interacting with the business and the IT folks, saying, "Okay, here's the big things that we need." I don't want to outsource that. I don't want to outsource the interaction with our customers in our company, and so that's kind of why we've done that. But But it truly came down to the skill sets and the timing. You know, we don't have the capability of having 24/7 facilities for people to sit in and to watch logs and monitor. And so it was an easy decision for us. It's been a great one, but as we've continued to grow as a security organization, we're starting to outgrow our MSSP, and it's to the point where, you know, we're wanting more functionality, we're wanting more capabilities to control it, and it's not there. So, you know, the shift seems to kind of come back and forth between do you outsource, do you bring it back in? Now we're back in the discussion of do we bring it back in again? Is that really where we are? And it just is a matter of time where you are in your maturity, and from that company's perspective, I mean, it's going to keep flipping back and forth depending on where you are and how, as you're growing.
How would you deal with insourcing implementation versus outsourcing to sometimes other countries? Like, I was just saying about, you know, contractually on some data going out of the country. How about some of the communication issues, some of the cultural issues? Talk a little bit about how you address those situations and move it.
Well, we have that. So we have time difference issues. We have understanding issues. A lot of times the offshore people that they're hiring are very basic skills. They're following a script. So if you want any additional work from them, you have to redo a script or work with them. And it just seems that you never get what you want. Probably 25% of our work is rework because of the lack of understanding, the timeliness because of the time differences that we deal with. I see it every day. I have an issue every day that I have to send an email to somebody because something wasn't done, or somebody sent an email to me because it wasn't done in the time it was supposed to be.
Idioms are your enemy.
And you got to kind of expect that too, and especially on a new agreement where you're just starting with a new company, you're going to have to build that into your timeline, that transition time. While we're not doing our security, there is another aspect of the business that we do have outsourced, and there was a point in time where we were running parallel, where in-source staff was still doing some of the work while the outsourced staff was getting up to speed. And at the point that the outsourced staff was finally coming on board and getting up to speed, we started transitioning the work more and more with them and reallocating the in-source or the local staff. So you just got to kind of build that into your timeline as you start those agreements.
It's okay if you have offshore resources to tell the contracting group that you want them dedicated to your company. And that's how our agreements are. The people who work offshore are dedicated to Cardinal Health. They don't work on any other customers. They are our employees, for lack of better terms. And it is good if you're a global organization to have the support, you know, for somebody who's around the clock, you know, whether our folks are sitting offshore, they can support our China operations when we're not in the office. It's worked out for us from that perspective, but, you know, you have to go into the contract and you have to make it to where it's beneficial to you, and you have the right to say, I want the dedicated resources, I want them only on my contract, and that's how it works a lot of times from our perspective.
Sometimes that's going to cost you a little bit more, but it might be worth it in the long run.
So let me jump in on that one. I actually find the questions about offshore and other countries and other time zones sort of interesting. You've got cultural problems between downtown Columbus and Westerville, right? Right? So the cultural things is just management 101. I think the compliance question is, it really goes back to, you've got to make sure that you are assuring that whoever you have, whether they're employees or not employees, are doing what they're meant to be doing. Now, the problem with offshore is that you have different compliance standards, but that's not necessarily a security function problem. That's what data do you deal with in that particular environment. So you've got to make the business call of where does it make the most sense to put this particular service based on the kind of data they're going to be handling, right? So if you don't want to put your stuff in Singapore where you've got to have triple break glass and 25 layers of oversight and double this, and it takes you 25 years just to get a root account on a Unix box, then don't put it in Singapore, right? put it in Westville. That's fine. But there's going to be stuff that you can do offshore, but you've got to make sure that they're doing what they said they would do. At a previous company, we had a contract company not doing security but just doing other stuff, and we realized in our contract we said you will comply with our security requirements, and we realized that 750 of their development staff had not had any training on our compliance requirements. So how the hell did they think they were complying with our compliance requirements, right? And so we had to make sure that we were doing everything with them as we would with employees. And if you do that, your compliance officers are going to be fine.
And go ahead.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'll tell you, we started doing that at a previous company, and then we had this whole issue: are they employees or are they contractors? So, yeah, there's a fine line to be careful of.
And if you have specific deliverables for compliance, put those in your contract. State that the company has to collect whatever evidence is necessary to meet your compliance requirements. Then if they fail it, now you've got legal ramification or legal recourse to go back against them if they don't fulfill the requirements. And you show that you were doing what you were supposed to, they failed.
You have to write the audit clause. I mean, it's in almost every contract. You have every right to go and audit them on the things that you have concerns about from a compliance perspective. And a lot of companies today have, the SOC 2 reports, they have the ISO certifications, they have that kind of documentation that they can present to you as well. And if you're not comfortable with it, it is a right if it's in your contract to go review it.
Don't be afraid to put that clause in contracts. You're a fool if you do, because it's vitally important to make sure you have the right to audit your third parties.
You will likely have to go to their location now. So if you want to go to Singapore, have it in.
Service level agreements a little bit. Perspective on that, and what effectiveness of it do you think really important is something that you have an opportunity to do or what should be?
So I'm dealing with one at the moment. At OSU, we have an agreement with a company that would provide call center support, letters, that kind of stuff if we were breached, right? This particular vendor, I think, has been involved in every major incident. And they're now coming back and saying, we know before you used to be on retainer and whatever, but now we really want you to be on retainer. And unless you go on like a gold level of retainer, we won't guarantee that we can respond, because we won't have the call center staff available because they'll be dealing with Anthem or Target, whoever, right? So the question is, well, what's their SLA worth, right? And do I have to pay for that? And so this comes the question, right? Is what's the value of it? Do I ask, all of you with college-age students to up your tuition rates so that if I have the next big breach, I've got 200 people in Texas on the phone ready to cover your personally identifiable information, right? You've got to make the call on the value of it. But I think you've also got to watch for overselling vendors who will tell you that they can give you everything in a hurry, when practically speaking, you've got to really question if they could, right? So don't believe the salespeople. Okay, don't believe all salespeople. Sorry, salespeople.
So on that topic, especially about trusting people, when we do contract supplements, we get a wide variety of responses, and sometimes we get the response, "Yep, we accept everything, no edits." That concerns me. If there's no edits, then they never read the contract supplement, because there's stuff in there that if I got that contract supplement, I would want to edit, because I know that there's different ways different people do things. So when you go through and you do a contract, ask them, are you sure? Have you read this? And of course, that always brings up the question, well, am I shooting myself in the foot by asking them to read it? But if you don't, and they don't comply, then you're just going to be tied up in legal incidents for the rest of the time that contract is in place. There's others that I've had people just absolutely refuse to add our security supplement to their contracts. Is it worth the business? Are you willing to sever your tie with that vendor because they won't put security contract supplement in place. That's something you have to decide, and typically what we do is we let the business make that decision, and then we have the right, security team has the right to override that if we feel it's too great, but we let the business make the decision, and we have actually a signature on a document that says, I accept any breach or any incident that occurs because of my acceptance of this risk by not having the supplement in place. Absolutely.
They're in it for the same reason. They're reviewing those contracts.
Absolutely.
Another question right here.
I'm right about that. Right now, establishing a hybrid IT hiring
Alluded to that earlier, didn't you?
Yeah, it is kind of overwhelming at times when you see the list of vendors who support different technologies. You know, we have a multitude of ways of doing it at Cardinal. You know, we actually look at things such as Gartner, Forrester, what those recommendations are. We rely on some of our vendors who aren't tools specific. You know, similar to Rocky sitting there, you know, and what their thoughts are and their perspective on different tool sets. You know, we reach out to others. And now that, you know, the collaboratory is here in Columbus and we're a member of that, you know, we've started some communication with some of those folks from the other companies. What are you guys using? You know, what do you think of some tools, you know? And so we've had some great conversations with folks on what others. And I think the peer groups that you have are sometimes your best references on what they're using, what works for them. You know, it's great when somebody can write up a paper, you know, on something, but if you actually talk to somebody who's using it, I think that's sometimes the best source from our perspective, and that's how we typically narrow it down. We do the research, you know, from the papers that are out there, but just talking to people really is the last thing that narrows it down for us, what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, I think I could second that. I'm going to spend a lot of time, you know, I talk about relationships. I'm going to spend a lot of time working on that relationship, but I'm also going to look at references. How did they do? What do other people say about them? This conference is a great place to start talking to other people who may use their product, understand their product, work with them as a vendor. And I'll use that to trim that down as well. You know, I've been in situations where I've looked at outsourcing, and I've gone out and looked at big major companies to do the task that I'm looking at. And then I've looked at more regional providers, and in some cases I found that those regional providers do a very, very good job. Their reports were dead on, and I tended to feel like I got it better. Now, I'm not saying don't go to the big providers, but you know, you've got to look at that and understand what they're going to give you and what you're going to get for your money from it, and just do your background work. Like
yeah,
I was saying.
And I think to the last point that you had is sometimes you don't know somebody at that company. It's okay to call them up. I am the first person who, according to Lockheed Martin, ever called their customer service line asking for a sales rep. You know, and it was because we'd never used them. I mean, it's Lockheed. You know, they're that big security group out there that, you know, people dream of using sometimes is what they tell me. And it's literally one of those things where I didn't have a number. We never used them. So I called their customer service line and said, hey, I need a rep. And guy called me back a day later and he said, are you sure? Did you really need me? And I'm like, yeah, I did. And he found out who I was with and he said, oh my, I'm so sorry, you know, you didn't have anyone's number. But it's just things like that. It's okay to just call somebody up and get some information from them.
And depending on the types of services you're looking for, research the internet. Has members of their company been involved in release of information about companies that wasn't authorized for release? And then also, if you've got specific security requirements, put those in your RFP, see how they respond to those requirements, and that can weed out a few as well. Not that they're always, truthful, but at least it gives you a method of weeding them out. If they are truthful and they say, no, we don't do this, that might be a disqualifier for them, and it can be a very quick disqualifier.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask the panel real quick to run down the table and give us one takeaway from their thoughts of what we've discussed today. So, start to far end. Is that okay?
Right. So I think just if you look at when you're dealing with outsourcing, the relationship is a big thing. Have it in writing. If you're doing cloud, make sure everybody has it in black and white, what you're doing, and make sure they're doing. And when you talk about like the IDSs, one thing is are you auditing what they're doing? Is the data they're producing, are they alerting on the right thing? Sometimes you have to validate what they're doing.
To get a little esoteric, before you go outsourcing security, I would suggest that you make sure that whatever you're trying to outsource, it makes sense in the context of your overall mission of your security program. So at OSU, one of the things I'm pushing really hard on is trying to make security everybody's business, not the security teams, not the IT teams, everybody's business. If I go and outsource something that's very visible to our customers, it's just one more leg of separation that gives them a reason not to care about security, right? So also think about the political implication of having that outside the company versus inside the company and where that fits with your overall roadmap.
I would have to agree with that as well. I would look at plan. Make sure you plan out what you're tasked with doing. As I said earlier, what are you tasked with protecting, and then plan to that. If you can do a BIA, then you've got your business buy-in on what you're trying to do right from that, and you can start moving that forward.
I'd say think about the risk. What are you outsourcing? What is included with that being outsourced? And what is the risk to your business? Is this something that could, put you on the front page of the paper? If it is, it's probably not worth it.
I think the balance between the contract and the relationship is important enough to find a balance between the two. Your contract may have the nth degree of language in it to protect you against all situations that you can think of at the time, but only your relationship is going to save you for the times that you can't think of everything that might happen.
So when you're looking at it, Carla said, look at the risk, but also look at the cost. And not just the cost of the contract, but the cost of what you're going to have to do to make it a successful relationship. You may have to change your network infrastructure. You may have to add additional security components. Look at that cost as well. It's not just the contract, but what are you going to have to do? What resources are you going to have to make it a valuable endeavor for you?
All right. Well, I thank you all for coming, and be safe out there.